The ocean is vast, far bigger than anyone can really imagine when they haven't taken it on single handed. And of all the terrains the natural world has to offer, it is one of the most inhospitable. Humans are not meant to survive at sea. There is plenty of life under the water, of course, but we are poorly adapted to join it. At sea, we are no longer the king of hell. All of this makes Steve Callahan's 76 Days at Sea one of the most amazing stories of survival. A reminder of what humans are capable of when their bodies, minds, and souls are pushed to extremes. Hi, a very good morning. So today let's have a book reading session as planned. Unfortunately, because of technological constraints, we couldn't get a live session. So we'll have a recorded video. So I'll be going through the following book, True Grit, authored by Bear Grylls. So it's a very inspiring book, a collection of several inspiring real life, true event based stories. It's all about when humans are tested to extreme situations or conditions, how the best comes out of them. So that's a common scenario in almost each of these stories. So this book is a collection of various stories. So before I proceed with today's story, I would like to go with the introduction first because this is really amazing and inspiring. So Bear Grylls gives us the following introduction. One of the questions that I get asked over and over again is, who are my heroes, my influences, my inspirations? The truth is that it's not an easy question to answer. For sure, my father was a hero to me, adventurous, fun, humble, a man of people, a risk taker, a climber, a commando, and a loving, gentle father. But so much of what has driven me to push myself mentally, physically, and emotionally, including spiritually, has come from some unlikely sources. I hope this book will uncover and reveal to you some of the world's most inspiring, moving, and mind blowing feats of human endurance ever undertaken. There were many to choose from. Some of these stories you will know, many you will not. And for every story of pain and hardship, there were often dozens more I could have chosen for this collection. But what drives men and women to plumb such depths and to risk it all? Where do these wells of resilience, grit, and determination come from? Are we born with them or are they something we learn? Again, there are no simple answers. And if I have learned anything, it is that there is no mold for a hero. They come in all sorts of unlikely guises, and people often surprise themselves when tested. At the same time, I've seen people develop character and courage and self belief and vision from a young age, and it stands them well when their time of testing finally comes. I believe that we're all capable of great things, as well as having incredible reserves of strength that we might never know we possess. Like with a grape, you don't really know what it is made of until it is squeezed. One thing all these stories have in common is that in each case, every one of these individuals was squeezed to within an inch of their life, and they all had to find courage, tenacity, and fortitude when it looked like they had been run out. I hope that these stories will inspire you to be that little bit braver, that little bit stronger when your times of testing comes around. And remember, as Winston Churchill once said, when you're going through hell, keep going. But for now, sit back and relax and let me introduce you to my heroes. And I'll be selecting one inspiring story. Stephen Callahan. Why does someone dream of crossing an ocean in a tiny boat that could easily be crushed by tremendous forces at work in the waves? Why would they wish to endure the kind of relentless solitude that human beings are simply not used to. It's a question worth asking because so many have done it. The seven seas have been crossed single handed by all manner of sailors, and almost any of them would warrant a place in this book. Take Mick Dawson and Chris Martin, for example, who rowed 4,500 miles across the Pacific in 189 days. Or Laura Decker, who at the age of 14 had to battle not only the oceans but also the courts that took her into shared care with her parents to stop her becoming the youngest person to circumnavigate the globe single handed. Those both took great and true grit. But in 1981, 29-year-old Steve Callahan's tiny boat suffered the worst that the sea could throw at it. Steve's boat was called as Napoleon Solo, and he had built it himself. It was 20 feet long and well made. Steve had built a number of watertight containers into the hull to help its buoyancy in bad weather, but it was light enough to travel fast when the winds were right. Hull is nothing but the framework of a ship. So there is a special kind of bond between a sailor and his boat. That was definitely the case with Steve and Napoleon Solo. So with a mate, he used to cross the Atlantic, and he used it to cross Atlantic from west to east, and it held together well. But he would always had a dream, a solo transatlantic crossing from east to west. If you observe the map, it's almost 7,300 kilometers transatlantic route. So he actually wanted to do it solo. He wouldn't be the first to do it, and although not many vessels the size of Napoleon Solo had completed such a journey, some had managed to do it. But that wasn't the point for Steve. He wasn't out there to break records. He was just out there to test himself and his abilities and boat he had designed and built. So he wanted to test himself first. So he signed up for a transatlantic race called the Mini Transat. It would take him from England to Antigua in the Caribbean. As I said, 7,200 approximately the distance. At least that was the plan of Steve. So 3 days into the race, the weather grew alarmingly bad. The boat found itself riding to the top of 10-foot waves before crashing violently back down on the other side. The wind was screaming all around. The crash of the sea lashing against the boat was deafening, and the water was just coming in. The hull had cracked, that is the framework of the ship, and Steve knew it wouldn't be long before the force of ocean ripped the boat apart. So he had no option but to head for the Spanish coast. His race was over. It took 4 weeks for him to repair the boat, after which time Steve headed down to Canary Islands. He considered mooring in Tenerife for the winter, but the ocean was still calling to him. Mooring is nothing but anchoring. So he had set out to cross the Atlantic. He was out of the race, but that didn't mean he couldn't do it off his own back. And so on a clear night, 29th January 1982, he took to the water once again, and his destination was the Caribbean, which is almost 7,000 plus kilometers on the other side of the Atlantic. For a week he had calm seas and favorable winds. He ate well, rode, enjoyed his solitude surrounded by boundless sea and sky. But then on February 4th, things changed. The wind got up, boiling clouds rolled in, the sea became stormy, rising and falling. The weather was bad, but not impossible. Steve prepared to sit it out. So night fell, the wind and the waves grew stronger. He tried not to think about how many tons of water each massive wave contained, and he hunkered below decks, consoling himself with the thought that he had weathered storms like this before and survived. But then suddenly came a massive, ear-splitting noise. Something had hit the boat. Steve had no idea what it is, but he later decided that it must be some sort of a sea animal, a whale or a shark. So immense was the impact. He heard the sound of hull ripping apart. Then suddenly water was crashing over him. The boat was going down, and if Steve didn't get off it quickly, he would be going down with it. There was a life raft on board. Steve burst through the hatch that led to the deck where it was kept. He was supposed to get the raft into the water before inflating it, but there wasn't time. So he yanked the cord and raft inflated just as a wave hit. Steve jumped into the raft and the wave carried him off the deck and onto the tempestuous ocean. Tempestuous is nothing but stormy. A halyard, that is a rope connecting the raft to the solo, was still intact. Steve wasn't going to break it yet. It wasn't just that he loved that boat, it also contained emergency supplies. Somehow he needed to get his hands on them before the boat sank completely or was broken up by the waves. He wouldn't survive long without them. But that meant reboarding a sinking boat from the raft. So he was cold, drenched, and his eyes stung from the driving salt spray. But the survival instinct in him was strong. He pulled himself up towards the side of the sinking boat and climbed aboard again. Ignoring the huge waves looming and crashing above him, he lowered himself once more down the hatch and into the cabin. With a bang, the hatch shut fast behind him. It was strange quietly in the cabin as he gasped for air, submerged himself, and then felt blindly for his emergency bag. Once he had it, he struggled back through the hatch and hurled it back onto the raft. Then he returned to the cabin again, braving the dangers of waterlogged vessel to grab his sleeping bag. Back on the raft, he grabbed anything he saw floating out of the boat: a cabbage, a box of eggs, a tin of peanuts, and there were more vital supplies still on the boat. 10 gallons of water, survival rations to last up to 80 days, a thick neoprene survival unit, should he return again to the boat, which is actually submerging. But by now he was too exhausted to do any more. If he was going to brave the solo again, it would have to wait till the morning. For now he was abandoned on his circular inflatable raft, huddled under the tent-like structure that was supposed to protect him from the elements but which was being battered continually by huge curling waves. And then, well before dawn, it happened. The rope, that is halyard, attaching the raft to the solo broke in the roaring storm. Boat and raft drifted away from each other. Steve's limbs hurt with exhaustion and cold. His body ached with wounds he hadn't noticed as he escaped the boat. The storm was still raging, filling the life raft with cold, salty water. Steve engaged his sea anchor, a kind of underwater parachute, to slow you down so that he wouldn't capsize as he tumbled down the slopes of massive waves. Capsizing is nothing but overturning. Even so, it was touch and go. Steve knew that a single capsize would catapult him free and kill him. Night turned day, and the gale raged on. Steve had EPIRB, emergency position indicating radio beacon. It had a range of 250 miles and enough battery life for 72 hours. He turned it on, but deep down he knew it was useless. He was approximately 450 miles from the nearest shipping channels, and no planes passed this way. He was lost and alone, and nobody could hear him even scream. At night, he protected himself from hypothermia by wrapping up in his drenched sleeping bag. Almost instantly, his sore, salty skin erupted with hundreds of putrid boils. His back, knees, and bum were covered with cuts, bruises, and the salt stung continually as it wormed its way into his flesh. By day, he took notes of his equipment and tried to work out how long he would last with the supplies he had. 14 days maximum, he estimated, till he died of dehydration. So he had some solar stills in his survival pack. These work by using the heat of sun to evaporate salt water, then allowing the fresh water to condense and be collected. But they are useless when the sea is rough, when there is no sun. As long as the weather remained bad, he would have to rely on 8 pints of emergency water rations he had in the raft, and whatever rainwater he managed to collect. He rationed himself to a mouthful of water every 6 hours as he sat out of the storm. He couldn't drink seawater because the high levels of salt would poison his kidneys. There was water everywhere, but he might as well have been adrift in a desert. The storm finally subsided after 3 days, but when you are at sea, there are other kinds of weather you have to worry about. Invisible weather under the sea. The currents form massive underwater highways. If your raft gets caught in one of these, you have no choice but to submit to its mercy. Without sails or a motor, there is no way of getting out of these currents, and Steve found himself in one of them. He hoped that eventually it might take him to land. The question was, could he survive long enough to make this journey? On his fourth day at sea, Steve spotted a fin approaching. At first, he worried that it was a shark, but then he realized that he is being followed by a school of Dorados, big, strong little fish, and a potential source of food. He had a spear gun in his emergency kit, and as a Dorado came close to the boat, he tried to shoot it. If you have ever tried to use a spear gun, you'll know how difficult it is. Plus, the fish are fast, cunning, and water also refracts the light coming off them, so they are never quite where they appear to be. Steve missed, and he kept missing. The voracious hunger, now his constant companion, continued to gnaw away at his insides. Scabs started to form over the soles of his legs, but they were washed away again whenever a wave broke over the raft and his legs got wet. As he drifted west, the daytime temperature increased and it reached up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The solar stills returned nothing but salty water. He cooled himself down by pouring seawater over his body, all the while trying to ignore the agonies of his sores, thirst, and hunger. He tried again and again to spear a fish. On the 11th day, he managed it, but agonizingly, the fish escaped his weakening arms as he fought to pull it aboard. His water supplies were dwindling, he was beginning to starve, things were looking bad. True grit isn't just about endurance, it's about ingenuity too. Steve had a Tupperware box and some empty water cans. He managed to cobble this together into a solar still that actually produced fresh water, not salt. And finally, he managed to spear a fish, not a Dorado, but a much smaller triggerfish. They can be poisonous to humans and they taste so bad that even sharks avoid them. But he was past caring about that. He ripped his teeth into the tough flesh and sucked down the bitter blood. It was disgusting and made him want to be sick. He squished the ice between his teeth. He gobbled down the liver and other organs, then hung one fillet up to dry for later. He had water, he had little food, things were looking up, but not for long. The shark arrived when the waters were calm. Steve was asleep on the raft when he felt its thick grey skin rub against the bottom of the raft. If it punctured the raft with its teeth, that would be the end. Steve tried to spear it, but the point of spear rebounded off the shark's tough skin. The beast swam lazily away, but the very same night, as Steve was trying to sleep, another one arrived. It almost capsized the raft, but Steve managed to chase it away. It was a reminder, though, that at sea, calm waters can be as dangerous as rough ones. In the weeks that followed, Steve would have to fight off many more of these sharks as they tried to attack either his raft or the schools of Dorado that followed him. And it's nothing but next to impossible to survive under such situations. When he managed finally to spear a Dorado and bring it on board, he divided up the meat and dried it in the sun, rations for the day to follow. Then he discarded the inedible parts by throwing them far from the raft. If sharks were to detect the blood, and they probably would, he wanted them as far from the raft as possible. And on his 14th day at sea, Steve saw a ship in the distance. He fired emergency flares. They went unnoticed, unfortunately. It would happen several times during his voyage of endurance as he crossed two major shipping lanes. Each time they faded uselessly into the sky. The raft started to disintegrate. He had to keep it pumped up with emergency hand pumps, but the salt, sun, and battering of aggressive Dorados caused multiple punctures, releasing air from the raft and letting water in. He had a little repair kit, but just try repairing a puncture when the surfaces are wet. He was forced to improvise, plugging holes with pieces of sponge, tying cord tightly around the punctures to keep the air from hissing out, etc. But it was clear that the raft had a finite life. It was supposed to last for 40 days at sea, but 40 days had passed and still there was no sign of land. 40 days in sea. Steve's body was disintegrating too. He had no meat on his legs or behind, just bones sticking through the sore skin. He was covered with unhealed cuts and boils, which had grown bigger, become infected, burst, and turned into agonizing ulcers that grew wider, deeper with each passing day. He sustained himself with lumps of dried dorado. He worried that he had no urge to move his bowels, despite the large, puffy hemorrhoid bulging out from his backside. So was his gut shutting down? He looked like a wild man. Matted hair, bony body, skin covered in sores and fish scales. Days and nights and weeks passed. How long could he survive like this? He scraped rust from empty food cans into his drinking water to get some iron into his body. If he caught a dorado with undigested fish in its stomach, he gorged on it as if it were the greatest treat of all, two for the price of one. His spear gun broke and he had to improvise by trying to use a small blade and by tying it to a spear's shaft. But each time he struck a fish, the shaft buckled slightly. It wasn't going to last forever, and neither was he. Steve kept working. He never gave up. He used a folded canopy to catch rainwater. He managed to snare a couple of seabirds that landed on his disintegrating rubber boat, and he gorged on their meat, innards, and semi-digested silverfish in their guts. He continued to catch triggerfish and dorado to keep in the fight. By now, his body and mind were closing down. He later spoke of feeling the ghosts of all those who had ever been lost at sea surrounding him, hallucinations, waiting for him to become one of their but they would have to carry on waiting. Steve wasn't quite beaten yet. After 76 days adrift, alone at sea, Steve Callahan saw a lighthouse twinkling in the distance. It was the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. So he finally arrives to the Caribbean all the way from the Spain, crossing almost 7,000 plus kilometers. He knew his ordeal wasn't over yet, though the currents and waves could easily smash him against the rocks and he would be too weak to defend himself from the elements. But for once, luck was with him. He had been throwing inedible fish guts overboard, so a crowd of seabirds were following him. By chance, some fishermen saw the birds. Knowing that birds at sea normally mean fish nearby, they set out for some sport. But they found a very different quarry floating helplessly and close to death among the waves. They helped Steve aboard. He had lost a third of his body weight and it would take another 6 weeks before he would walk again. But after nearly 11 weeks railing against death, Steve Callahan was finally safe. The ocean is vast, far bigger than anyone can really imagine when they haven't taken it on single-handed. And of all the terrains the natural world has to offer, it is one of the most inhospitable. Humans are not meant to survive at sea. There is plenty of life under the water, of course, but we are poorly adapted to join it. At sea, we are no longer the king of hell. All of this makes Steve Callahan's 76 days at sea one of the most amazing stories of survival. A reminder of what humans are capable of when their bodies, minds, and souls are pushed to extremes.